This is Jesus' Last Supper, or at least I thought it was. And here's what I mean. I always thought that the Last Supper was simply Jesus and his disciples sitting around eating communion, until I realized that this meal is actually this meal. Each one of these items represents an essential element of Jesus' Last Supper, and the last one has the potential to completely change how we celebrate this meal. But first, let me tell you what each of these items has in common. You see, when Jesus sat down for his last meal, he didn't just dine on bread and wine. His table was full of food, all of which had specific meaning. And the night on which he ate this food wasn't just some random Thursday. It was a very specific day, actually the transition between two very specific days. You see, according to Luke's gospel, then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." What he's telling us is that the events of Jesus' Last Supper begin at the transition point between two very important Jewish holidays, the Festival of Unleavened Bread and Passover. For a long time, I didn't realize that these are actually two totally different Jewish festivals. And I also didn't realize that both of them are an incredibly important part of what's happening at the Last Supper. Passover was the festival remembering the last of the 10 plagues in Exodus, in which God passed over the homes of the Israelite people who had blood upon their doorframes, while taking the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, including the Pharaoh. This is why Jesus' table would have had hyssop. This was the plant that was used to brush the blood of the lamb on the doorposts in preparation for the Passover. Now, Jesus' table would have had a fresh bunch of the hyssop plant, but since this is hard to come by where I live, we have za'atar spice, which is a spice blend that is still used during Passover today because it contains sumac, sesame seeds, and, most importantly, hyssop. This spice was a reminder of the moment that forced Pharaoh's hand and caused him to free the Israelite people from slavery. And it was an essential element in Jesus' last meal. It recalled the story of God's past faithfulness to God's people, as did the next item, matzah, or unleavened bread. As I said, Jesus' Last Supper took place at the intersection of two festivals, Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread. This was the celebration of how the Israelite people prepared for their freedom. God told them not to put any yeast in their bread as they departed Egypt. They needed to leave quickly, and there was no time to let the bread rise. Matzah is the bread that is without yeast. It's a reminder of God's quick work, and also the challenges that they faced while they were being set free. But here's where things get really interesting. As Jesus progresses through these items with his disciples, he reveals that there's even more meaning to each of these than the disciples realize. In fact, everything on this table represents him. For instance, as I said, the bread that Jesus and the disciples were eating was unleavened, meaning it was without yeast. And in Hebrew culture, yeast represented decay. Jewish people believed that it was the yeast in the bread that allowed it to spoil and go bad. So leaven came to represent those things that allowed God's people to spoil and go bad. It represented sin and those things that separated the Israelite people from God. So when Jesus holds up this bread and says, "This is my body," he's saying something about his body. He is unblemished. He is unleavened. He is without sin. In other words, Jesus is proclaiming that he is a perfect, sinless offering for the people. But not only that, he's also making a promise about what will happen after he dies. Because just as the leaven doesn't decay, neither will his body. Just as the scriptures prophesied, "Therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. Yes, my body will dwell in safety, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. You will not give your faithful one to see the grave." The unleavened bread is the promise of Jesus' resurrection, and ours too. When he picks up the hyssop during the meal, he's connecting himself with the tool that God used to save God's people from death, which is exactly what Jesus is about to do. Because that leads us to the next item on the table, the lamb. The Passover lamb was a very specific type of lamb. It was unblemished. It had no marks or injuries. This lamb represented the lambs the people sacrificed on the original Passover, whose blood they posted on their doorposts, whose sacrifice ultimately led to their freedom. And it's Jesus' way of revealing that he will be this type of sacrifice. He is the unblemished lamb who will free the people from their slavery to sin. He's the one without leaven, without yeast, without sin. He is the one who will mark God's people and save them from suffering. He is everything on this table. But there's more. Because just as the lamb and the hyssop and the bread reveal the deeper meaning of this meal, so do the specific words that he says. Words that today are found in this book, the Talmud. You see, what I didn't realize for a long time was that the words that Jesus says at this dinner aren't original. For instance, when Luke tells us he took some bread and gave thanks to God for it, then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He's referring to a Jewish prayer called a hamotzi, a traditional prayer that blesses God for allowing bread to come forth from the earth. Jesus also would have blessed the wine with a prayer called a kiddush, a prayer that praises God for the fruit of the vine. Now, at the time of Jesus, prayers like these weren't found in a book like the Talmud. They were oral prayers that were passed down from generation to generation. And here is what's really important to remember. The hamotzi and the kiddush weren't just spoken at Passover. In fact, in my new book, The Forgotten Teachings of Jesus, I talk about how these were prayers that Jesus and his disciples would have prayed every week during their weekly Shabbat meal. For them, bread and wine were a regular part of life. Bread and wine had always been used to remember the Lord. Bread was associated with sustenance, with how God had always provided for the people. Wine was associated with celebration, rejoicing in the blessing of the Lord. And in the book, which you can check out by clicking the link above or down in the description, I talk about how these prayers were woven into their daily lives and prepared them for a moment like this. And here's why this is so important. It's at this point in the Last Supper that Jesus uses a specific phrase that we often repeat without understanding what it truly means. Multiple times, Jesus uses the phrase, "Remember me." And this is a big deal. You see, remembrance would have been a typical part of a meal like Passover. As they consumed foods like lamb, matzah, and bitter herbs, as they recited prayers like the hamotzi and the kiddush, they would remember who God is and what God had done for them. They were remembering how God provided during the Passover and in the wilderness. But notice what Jesus says. He says, "Remember me. Eat this bread and remember me. Drink this wine and remember me. Do what you've always done. Remember how faithful God has been, but in the future, also remember me." These things you do routinely, Passover, the hamotzi, the kiddush, these things should also remind you of me, of what I'm about to do for you. The bread will remind you of my body, which will be broken for you. This wine will remind you of my blood that will be shed for you. Remember these things, all of them. And it's that word remember that is absolutely critical to understanding all of this. Because what I didn't realize for a long time is that it doesn't mean what we think it does. At the time of Jesus, remembering wasn't just an act of recalling things that happened to some distant group of people long ago in the past. It was much more personal than that. This is why during the Passover Seder, people don't say when they were slaves in Egypt. They say when we were slaves in Egypt. It's not history, it's memory. And just as you can recall your wedding day or the birth of your child as if it was yesterday, just as you can experience those feelings and those emotions all over again, just as you can be transported there in your memory and experience the past in the present, Jesus is saying, that's what I want you to do here. Remember me. Because this won't just be some event of the past, but an experience in the present and a promise for the future. And then Jesus makes one other statement that ties everything together, something that his disciples interpreted much, much differently than we do. Something that ties directly back to this book right here, the Torah. Because when he takes the wine, he says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." And that phrase, new covenant, really isn't all that new when he says it. Because when Jesus talks about this new covenant, he's actually referring to a past promise, one made right here in the Torah. He's referring to a scripture by the prophet Jeremiah who says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah." It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And suddenly, everything Jesus has been saying comes into focus. We realize that all of this means so much more than we thought it did. Jesus is saying, through me, you can experience this new covenant. Through me, things can be different than they were with your ancestors. I am the one who can keep you close to the Lord because I am the bread without yeast. I am the perfect lamb who was slaughtered. And because of that, this new covenant can only be experienced through me. The law can only be upon your hearts if you have me. Your relationship with the Father can be restored through me. And that is why you do these things I command you, so that you always remember me, so that you will remember every part of this night and what it means and what I've done for you, lest like your ancestors you someday forget, and you must never forget. Do you see how that changes all of these things? This moment is so much more than just some important words spoken while eating bread and drinking wine. This whole experience is tied to the Passover and Shabbat and Jesus' Jewish background. And when we finally begin to see that, we begin to see that the meaning of communion is so much deeper than we ever realized. It forces us to ask, why don't we celebrate Passover as Jesus did? How might the prayers and the meal change how we experience communion? It challenges us to read Scripture differently, realizing that if we think like Jesus, all of this isn't just some story, it's our memory. We are part of this story, and the more we understand it, the deeper we will experience it. Which is why when we truly understand the Lord's Supper, it also gives us comfort because, as Jesus said, it's all about remembering. Remembering that God has been at work in our ancestors' lives for thousands of years, and God is not done. Every time we share the bread and the cup, we are reminded of this. Reminded that God can overcome our pain and our suffering. Reminded that God's plans are greater and bigger than any situation we or our world might be facing. And reminded that there is no one we need to look to save us but Jesus. The work has already been done. The Last Supper revealed it. And one of the most important things we can do is remember. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. And if you haven't done so already, make sure to pick up a copy of my new book, The Forgotten Teachings of Jesus, which will teach you even more amazing insights like the ones I shared in this video, and will allow you to see the chosen and read the Bible in an entirely new way. And if you'd like to check out another video that will do the same thing, then just click this link right here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.